For all that we have heard about the proposed Islamic center near Ground Zero in Lower Manhattan, all the noise, all the chatter, all the manufactured scare white people outrage, more notable tonight is what we have not heard. A rather deafening silence over the pattern of other disturbing anti-Muslim incidents nationwide. People who are supposedly against the Islamic Center in Lower Manhattan solely because of its proximity to the site of a national tragedy shouldn't on principle have anything against another Islamic center, say in Tennessee, right? Well, in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, over the weekend, a suspicious fire at the site of a proposed Islamic center damaged 4 pieces of heavy construction equipment. A spokesman for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms telling Talking Points memo that although the ATF is not ready to attach the word arson to the incident, they did find accelerant at the scene. There were also unconfirmed reports of gunshots fired near the site after the fire. The Murfreesboro incident, or possibly incidents, plural, come on course on top of the zoning challenge the proposed facility is facing, kind of like the challenges and protests being waged against planned mosques and Islamic centers in California, in Georgia, in Kentucky, in Wisconsin, in Illinois, as well as elsewhere in New York City. In addition to the protests and the legal battles, there's the even more disturbing but hard to qualify attack on New York City cabbie Ahmed Sharif by an alleged suspect named Michael Enright. Mr. Enright is accused of slashing and stabbing Mr. Sharif after apparently asking him if he was a Muslim. Also within the past week, also in New York City, a man was arrested for barging into a mosque during nightly prayers and shouting anti-Muslim slurs, urinating on prayer rugs, and giving the finger to congregates. Near Fresno, California, signs proclaiming no temple for the god of terrorism at Ground Zero were found not in Lower Manhattan, but outside the Maddow Islamic Center near Fresno, California. South of Los Angeles in Temecula, California, people protested outside of Friday prayers at a mosque that is hoping to build a new worship center nearby. A church in Gainesville, Florida, nearly 900 miles from New York City, says it is still planning an International Burn a Quran Day for, yes, September 11th, 2010. I guess all the other days were taken. As Adam Serwer of the American Prospect noted in the Washington Post today, the common thread may not be between all of these incidents themselves. Certainly it looks like a pattern, but until you know as much as you can about each of them, you can't necessarily tie them together as specific disturbing incidents. But maybe the tie between them is the opponents, who claim to be against the Park 51 Center near the World Trade Center site, solely as a matter of real estate. Location, location, location. Maybe the thing that ties together all of these things is them. If their opposition has nothing to do with Islam, nothing to do with stifling religious freedom, as they claim, if it's only about the specific location of that one Islamic center, then how come we're not hearing anything from them at all about all the other mosques being shot up and protested? Are Temecula and Fresno also just too darn close to Ground Zero? Joining us now is Steve Kornacki. He's news editor for Salon.com. Thanks for coming in, Steve.
Sure.
My big picture question about this is why we're seeing this sort of furious and quite widespread pattern of denunciations of mosques and people of the Islamic faith now. We did not see it in a way that people expected to see it after 9/11. Certainly there were incidents, but there was not a big, sort of party-wide system of attacks like we're seeing right now. Why now? Why not then?
Well, I think we were seeing it in different ways between 9/11 and now, but I think we're seeing it now, obviously, because the so-called Ground Zero mosque, the Park 51 project, has really kind of thrust this thing into the spotlight.
But that's not true, though, because the New York Times reported on the Islamic Center project 5 months before it ever made any sort of clamor whatsoever, even on Fox News. There were Fox News personalities who talked about the mosque after the New York Times broke the story 5 months ago and said it seemed like a nice idea. And then all of a sudden, now, as we're heading into campaign season, boom, it's a huge controversy.
Sure, but if you look in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, a lot of people tend to focus on what former President George W. Bush said at the time, which was something that was pretty admirable, which he came out and he said, and he made a clear distinction between we're going to go wage a war in Afghanistan and then ultimately in Iraq, but we're not fighting Islam as a religion. That was his rhetoric. That was the rhetoric of a lot of other Republican leaders at the time. That was not, however, uniformly the rhetoric of the right wing in this country. And I'm not talking about the right wing fringe. I'm talking about the mainstream of the right wing movement. If you listen to Rush Limbaugh's shows, shows from not far after 9/11 and for the last 7 or 8 years. If you listen to a guy like Sean Hannity, if you listen to very prominent voices on the right, if you listen to many right-wing politicians, conservative politicians in this country between now and then, the message that was delivered to listeners, the message that was delivered to the audience was very clear, and there was not any distinction drawn between that. So I think you had sort of, these adult voices, if you will, at the top of the Republican Party, at the top of the conservative movement, in George W. Bush, for instance, who were urging this sort of, to split your feelings about these things, but that was not at all uniform. And now I think it's bubbling to the surface. And I think the reality is George W. Bush, for all of his rhetoric, let's not forget the policies that he embraced as president. The policies he embraced enabled the clash of civilization types. The people who have always believed that the next great fight after communism was a clash between Western values, Western civilization, and Islamic values and Islamic civilization. They wanted the policies that George W. Bush pursued immediately and reflexively in response to 9/11. He surrounded himself with clash of civilization types. He bought into their vision and he implemented it. And he won over every voter in this country, I believe, or just about every voter in 2004, and I think there are quite a few of them who are moved by Islamophobic rhetoric. So the Republican Party and the conservative movement cemented itself, I believe, in response to 9/11 as an Islamophobic party and as an Islamophobic movement. Take Bush out of the equation, there's nothing left except that rhetoric, which I think we're now hearing and seeing a lot more of.
So
but I
you
think it's
feel
been
like
there for
that
a long
rhetoric
time.
was sort of seeded in the conservative movement, and now with the Republican Party not having leaders who are willing to say, we need to make sure this is not a war on Muslims, then it just sort of runs amok.
Here, I think, is the most telling thing. If you can think back to 2007 when Rudy Giuliani was running for president. Now, think about this. Pro-choice, pro-gay rights. There were pictures of him cross-dressing at one point when he was the mayor of New York City. He runs for president, and who endorses him? Pat Robertson. I can't think of a greater contrast on social and cultural issues, domestic social and cultural issues, than that exists between Rudy Giuliani and Pat Robertson. Why? The glue that bound them together and the glue that still binds them together is Islamophobia. It is Rudy Giuliani's embrace of the exact same foreign policy vision that George W. Bush in his first term embraced, and that Pat Robertson, who is a classic clash of civilizations type, has long embraced and long argued for. It brought them together, and it is so powerful that it was enough to override abortion for Pat Robertson.
Amazing. He still can leg press 2,000 pounds, though, which is the most important thing to know about Pat Robertson. Steve Kornacki, news editor for Salon. Thanks very much for coming in. It's good to have you here.
Sure.
Coming up after our show, a countdown exclusive. Who Glenn Beck was really listening to at his rally this weekend. It will make everything very much clearer. Coming up on this show, a room full of Italian models and Colonel Muammar Gaddafi of Libya. Same story, totally incongruous. I'll explain next.